Thanks, Ellen, and let me also thank and congratulate Montpelier, the Knox Museum, and its Board of Trustees for inviting Abderrahim Foukara and making this evening possible. Before I turn it over to our speaker, a few administrative details. We're going to have both written and spoken questions. There are interns in the aisles, and there will be while Abderrahim is talking. You can signal them. We'll give you a paper, pencil. If you prefer to write down your question, you can do so. Give it back to the intern, and he'll give it to me. I'll probably alternate between written questions and live ones on the floor. And one final thing, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the effort that Act for America, I think that's the correct name, made to increase awareness of this event. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this group, most of us were, I'm sure, they're the ones that were picketing in front of the theater. Their active PR campaign against Montpelier for hosting this event has so increased public awareness that as a result, I estimate that our ticket sales were up by as much as 50%. It's great to have people like that working against you. As Ellen mentioned, I've been involved with the Camden Conference for many years. In choosing our speakers this year for our February conference, I'm going to try to make sure we get someone that Act of America disapproves. So that'll help to boost our attendance as well. And now let me introduce the subject of all this totally unnecessary controversy, Abderrahim Foukara. He's a Moroccan native. In 1990, he joined the BBC World Service, where he worked as producer, reporter, anchor, and journalism instructor in various departments. In 1999, he moved to Boston to join The World, which is a co-production of the BBC, Public Radio, and WGBH Boston. In 2001, he continued to report for the BBC out of DC. And in 2002, he joined Aljazeera satellite channel in Washington, and is currently the channel's Washington bureau chief, host of Mid-Washington, which is from Washington in Arabic, a weekly roundtable show on American political and cultural affairs. He's been a frequent guest on National Public Radio's Diane Green Show, NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, CNN, MSNBC, and many others. So it's a great privilege for us in Rovkland and Camden and the Mid-Coast to have Dr. Foukara here. Let's give him a round.
It is a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, so buckle up, get some strong black coffee. But seriously, it is a great privilege for me to be here at the Strand tonight. There are two main areas I would like to deal with in this speech, as I try to bring out the general outlines of how I see the events unfolding in North Africa and the Middle East since Tunisia erupted some 9 months ago. Area 1. The so-called Arab Spring, its chances of success and risks of failure, and what either scenario could hold for the future of the region per se. Area number 2. As you know, many people in the Arab Muslim world, as well as in the United States, feel that the Arab-Israeli conflict, the 9/11 attacks, the invasion of Iraq and other situations may have irrevocably poisoned the well of relations between the two sides. I am not as grimly pessimistic. I will argue that a different understanding of history, together with a successful Arab Spring, could offer unprecedented hope out of the current dilapidation of those relations between the Arab world and the United States. For the record, and this will be an organic part of my overall argument, I use the terms like Arab and Muslim world and the West generically, just in order to give myself an intellectual handle on a set of complex realities that are often fluid and unwieldy. As you know, you can delineate geography, but you cannot delineate the flow of human history. To me, the Arab-Muslim world and the West represent a set of separate identities that sometimes clash, sometimes overlap, and sometimes simply merge together. For example, there have been many wars and deadly misunderstandings between the world of Islam and the Christian West. But millions of Muslims have become part and parcel of the Christian West, while Christians have lived in the Middle East long before the West became Christian. Jesus, like Muhammad and Moses and many other messengers, was a Middle Easterner. The fluidity is sometimes infinitely more subtle. One of the most beautiful and magical sounding words in the English language is serendipity, first borrowed from either Arabic or Sanskrit by England's Horace Walpole in the 18th century. Human history, as you know, is full of serendipity. Christopher Columbus set out to find the East, but ended up finding America. Perhaps America ended up finding him. But the most recent serendipity is the outbreak of the so-called Arab Spring. People who had thought they would never find their voice suddenly did find it. I am so moved to be here tonight. I am so moved that I will ask you to bear with me as I pay tribute to my late father, who toiled for me all his life. He took my little hand one day, many moons ago, and led me to school, where I learned to read and write. To my mother, may she always be healthy and funny. She taught me how to dream of wonderful things and wonderful places. To my siblings, whose spirit taught me how to conquer the solitude of roads less traveled by I have sometimes taken in my life. And finally, I would like to pay tribute to the General Henry Knox Museum and all the other people who've worked hard to bring me to this wonderful part of the United States, the state of Maine. Let me restate the obvious. I'm an Arab and would therefore be in dereliction of my Arabness if I didn't pay tribute to poetry, the hallmark of Arab culture, and to history, which the Arabs possess in abundance, though they sometimes allow it to consume them more than it should be allowed to, I think. I've also lived in this forward-looking country, the United States of America, for many years. I am hoping that that would redress the balance for me between the lure of the past and the energy of the future. Several centuries ago, a poet from Muslim Spain called Abu al-Baqa Randi eulogized the last Muslim kingdom there, Granada, when it fell or was reconquered, depending on which way you look at it. He said, لكل شيء إذا ما تم نقصان فلا يغر بطيب العيش إنسان هي الأمور كما شاهدتها دول من سره زمن ساءته أزمان وهذه الدار لا تبقي على أحد ولا يدوم على حال لها شان. Every perfection has an imperfection. So don't be fooled by life's comforts. This world is a succession of states and eras. You do well in one era, but may do badly in many. In this life, no one lasts forever, and nothing is forever the same. With that poem and more contemporary and pressing issues in mind, I once asked the then chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, if America's allies in the Muslim world could bank on continued U.S. global power, given the rise of China. We're going through a challenging time right now, along with many of our friends, the Admiral said, but certainly in terms of dependency, responsibility, leadership, and commitment to the future, I would not underestimate my country for 1 second, he concluded. The two words that most impress me in Mullen's statement are commitment and future, because they tie directly into my own personal observations since I've been in the United States. Throughout human history, knowledge has always been essential to both power and progress. I find Americans' commitment to and faith in knowledge serious food for thought. I hope you don't think that's a terrible metaphor. I'm thinking here about Americans who donate tens, nay, hundreds of millions of dollars of their own private money to institutions of knowledge and research. I haven't seen or heard of anything on that scale anywhere else in the world. It stands to reason that Columbus's big 1492 accomplishment, and hence America's subsequent meteoric rise as a superpower, would not have been possible without such extraordinary commitment to discovery and knowledge. This is a statement of neither deference nor sycophancy on my part. It is an expression of my own conviction that the Arabs and the Americans have much to learn from each other's history, especially as they both stand at this extraordinary junction between the past and the future called the Arab Spring. The power of faith in knowledge is historically not unfamiliar to Arabs and Muslims. People of faith are few, and people of knowledge are few. But even fewer than the few are people who have both faith and knowledge. Those words are Ibn Tufaylis, a Muslim thinker from Muslim Spain, more commonly known to Arabs and Muslims as Al-Andalus, or Paradise. The history books often describe Al-Andalus as a place which produced great works of literature, philosophy, science, and many other sublime expressions of human endeavor. They also describe it as a place that aspired to tolerance and human dignity for all who lived on its soil, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Does that ring a bell with you as Americans? I know I'm not, and if I were able, I know I'm not able to draw clear-cut lines between what is supposed to be quintessentially Muslim and what is supposed to be quintessentially Western. If I were, 1492 would represent a fundamental bifurcation. To many Muslims, but also Jews, by the way, 1492 is often recalled as a year of tragedy, a year when they lost paradise, Al-Andalus, and their ancestors were given their final choice: convert to Catholicism, get out, or else. To many Christians, however, 1492 represents paradise regained, the year Italy's now famous son, Christopher Columbus, set sail from Spain and ended up discovering America, thus eventually shifting the world's center of gravity from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. But there is a third way to look at 1492, which is often ignored by both Muslims and Christians. Without having lost paradise in 1492, the world may not have regained it in 1492. The newly found confidence and ambition of the Catholic kings of Spain inspired them to try to spread their sails and influence. And that's where the story of discovering America, as we all know, began. According to some historical accounts, Columbus's expedition was funded, at least in part, by some of the riches confiscated from Andalusian Muslims and Jews. Nor would the expedition, according to those same accounts, have reached the shore of safety without an Istorlab, an ancient nautical GPS, known in English today as the astrolabe, and introduced to Europe through Al-Andalus in the 12th century. Mind you, given that Columbus initially thought he was going to Asia, ended up in America, meant that his knowledge of GPS system needed some tweaking. But what do you expect? He's a guy. I would also argue that many of the African slaves brought to the Americas were from then already Muslim West Africa. Many of those slaves had been captured by European slave traders. But it must be said that Muslim slave traders also played their part in the capturing sometimes, but that's a story for another day. The point here is that even where there is intense heat in relations between the Muslim world and the United States, there are also cools of the day. They need to be found. Many Arabs and Muslims have concluded that what they see as America's support, not for Israel, but for Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands, does not bode well for justice in the region. That is one source of intense heat in the relations between the United States and the Arab world. So is the killing of thousands of innocent people on 9/11. So is the killing of innocent people in Iraq and other places. That heat has led some people in the Muslim world and in the United States, as we all know, to conclude that their side is completely right and the other side is completely wrong. As a result of that, we often hear people on either side talk of Judeo-Christian tradition versus Islamic tradition. So let us be frank here. Jews have for long centuries contributed to every sphere of life in the Muslim world. Jewish scientist and philosopher Moshe Maimonides, known in Arabic as Musa ibn Maymun, is sometimes described as one of the foremost rabbinical arbiters and philosophers in Jewish history. Maimonides was born in Muslim Spain, where he lived part of his life before moving to Morocco and eventually to Egypt, where his remains are still buried. It wasn't always a smooth ride for him as a Jew, but the context in which he flourished and contributed to human grandeur was definitely Islam. Here is a concomitant paradox of the world in which we live today. The smaller the global village feels, the more reductionist the language and imagery used to describe its complexities. I sometimes hear Muslims describe Christianity, for example, not as the religion used by man in a specific time and place to justify lynching and genocide, but as the religion of lynchings and genocide, period. Those people never say a word about Christians who, in the name of Christianity, combated lynchings and genocide. I also hear some non-Muslims say that Islam is a religion of terror, forgetting that there are 1 billion Muslims in the world, more than 1 billion Muslims in the world, who interpret Islam differently and apply it differently. Saudi Arabia's application of Islam is not exactly Indonesia's, nor is Indonesia's exactly Turkey's. Both camps need to listen to themselves as they utter the words they do. Homer says in the Iliad that words have wings. You can never be sure where or how words will land once they are out of their speaker's lips, how they will be heard or interpreted. Words can elevate the human spirit to its highest heights, or they can unleash mankind's descent into the lowest lows. Well, we've seen some extremely tragic lows of late. So I ask, how is the Norwegian man who slaughtered dozens of innocent people in Norway a few days ago different from the wild bunch behind 9/11? Well, he's a Christian, of Christian background, while they were from Muslim background. So what? In both cases, it was death meted out to innocent civilians. If there are people in the world today who see any difference there, then the world is heading in a direction even scarier than thus far assumed. For all the attacks against him regarding the invasion of Iraq and other controversial policies he pursued in the Muslim world, President George W. Bush, widely perceived as a devout Christian, was so quick to visit a mosque after 9/11 and to strongly urge the protection of law-abiding American Muslims against any possible acts of revenge. The man, so often described as the black or white forget grey president, also demonstrated that the world sometimes does not yield itself to either black or white. It must be seen in shades of grey. Now, let me get a little closer to the so-called Arab Spring. The story of why Jewish communities who had contributed so much to the Arab Islamic civilization in the past have dwindled so drastically in more recent times there certainly has a lot to do with their mass immigration to Israel. But the larger story of minorities in the Arab and Muslim world as a whole, and which has been part of the political predicament of the region, seems to be moving to the center of the debate, even as the momentum of the so-called Arab Spring ebbs in one place and flows in another in North Africa and the Middle East. To my mind, one of the most crucial barometers for measuring the success of that spring will be how quickly and decisively Arabs can spring to deal with the issue of minorities and citizenship in their power structures. By the way, listening to Muslim and Christian Arabs inside Israel complain that they are treated like second-class citizens in a country largely democratic to Jews, it will be interesting to see how the so-called Arab Spring may or may not impact that debate among Israelis. An Arab journalist has recently published an article in which he made what might seem as a banal observation to many Americans, but to Arabs seeking change, it perhaps goes to the heart of the matter. American presidents, he wrote in his article, always start their speeches to the American people with the phrase, "My fellow Americans." Fellow obviously implies that all Americans are urged to aspire to be equal before the law. The American Constitution, or at least how it sounds to my layman ears, because I'm not a constitutional expert, is not just a mere piece of paper where a bunch of middle-aged, rich white guys hurriedly scribbled squiggles for a crowd happy to see the back of British redcoats. The American Constitution, to me, is a live and meaningful political philosophy that guarantees at least that life in America will be a constant state of revision and amendment to meet new or rejuvenating aspirations for change and redress. That is how I would recommend Arabs to read it at this crucial point in their history, regardless of how they feel about U.S. foreign policy over Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, or any other foreign policy issue. That is because politicians and policies change, they come and go. But the spirit that seeks to learn how to improve the human condition is a constant. The Arab world is a dazzling fabric of diversity. If you think that America is a melting pot, take a look at the skin color rainbow in a country like Morocco, or at the churches and minorities of the Levant, such as in Syria. But if you don't have a framework which lets people find their potential in defining the rights and the responsibilities of citizenship, the dazzle will not meet the razzle. That's the bottom line. Syrian protesters have built a lot of momentum in their pursuit of liberty these past few weeks and have continued to brave bullets and tanks in ever-increasing numbers. But the specter of sectarian and ethnic strife has also reared its head, at least in some parts of the country. As the protesters accused the Syrian regime of buttressing its struggle to survive in the politics of divide and rule, it must also be noted that in Syria and elsewhere in the region, there are minorities who feel threatened by the majority or vice versa. That is where it becomes very important to take a very close look at how a constitution such as America's deals with the issue of protecting both majorities and minorities from each other's tyranny. I mentioned earlier the attachment of Arabs and Muslims to Al-Andalus as a metaphor for past glories. That metaphor is not without literal relevance to the so-called Arab Spring, as long as the Arabs and Muslims accept that the only Al-Andalus worth seeking today is not Spain or the past, but the future, which has a well-known address to many young protesters on the move across North Africa and the Middle East. That address is good governance, accountability, dignity, and citizenship. To my mind, that is the only Al-Andalus likely to give back to the Arabs their civilizational istiqlal and set their sails towards producing their own human greatness instead of being consumers of the greatness once produced by their ancestors or currently produced by the Americans or the Japanese or the Chinese or anybody else. Given the region's enormous challenges, politically, economically, socially, and almost every other illy, I sometimes feel that lack of democracy and participation in many parts of the Middle East and North Africa could actually become an existential threat to the political survival of the region and to the viability of the entire international system upon which or around which it is built. Look at the Arab African nation of Sudan. Just a few weeks ago, Sudan was one country. Today, it is two separate ones, one mostly Muslim in the north and the other mostly Christian and animist in the south. Fact. The country's borders were randomly drawn up by the British several decades ago. But several decades of an independence of sorts have not alleviated the impact of the deadly and debilitating conflict between the north and the south. Fact. There has always been foreign political and religious interference in that conflict, but the stronger north has not done enough to make southerners feel they have a fair or even real shake as citizens. And southerners are not alone in that grievance, as the political system of the country as a whole was not built on the principle of citizenship. The silver lining in all this is that the entire region seems to be finally moving, going somewhere new. I'm not yet sure we can speak of a new dawn, but the stirrings seem to be producing sparks of hope. Obviously, even if the peoples of the region, led by the youth, acted with deliberate wisdom and a clear sense of purpose, it may take some time to get the sack on the back. Democracy may not necessarily be a panacea for all ills, but as far as I know, it is so far the best doctor in town. The US is an established democracy, but that has not completely prevented race riots or financial meltdowns. In Britain, the cradle of parliamentary democracy, when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, she tried for years to shake the country out of its 1970s and early to mid-1980s sick man of Europe status. She did it in the end, though at some significant cost to social justice and to her popularity, both inside the UK and outside it. I don't know how many of you still recall the old American joke that America had Ronald Reagan, Johnny Cash, and Bob Hope, while Britain had Thatcher, no cash, and no hope. In the end, Thatcher did make Britain cash and did give the British, or at least many of them, hope. But she also got addicted to power in the process and had to be dragged screaming out of it by her own Tory party. When she left 10 Downing Street on her last day as Prime Minister, she was literally shedding tears. But what the Iron Lady, as she was nicknamed, didn't do was to shed the blood of her fellow Britons using tanks or Grad missiles to stay in power. A democratic system minimizes a leader's ability to delay the democratic inevitable. That is the magic of it. Although, not so surprisingly, the inevitable cannot be delayed even in dictatorship, as determined freedom-seeking young Tunisians and Egyptians have already shown us. Americans know a thing or two about breaking the shackles of tyranny, political or otherwise. They did it when many of them voted to elect an African-American president for the first time in the country's history. He may not have lived up to every expectation, but he may yet redefine his presidency. We shall see. Many people in this country, the United States, say that the breaking of shackles began way back in 1776, when the British Crown was told back then what young Tunisians have told their former president and the rest of the world more recently. إذا الشعب يوما أراد الحياة فلا بد أن يستجيب القدر ولا بد لليل أن ينجلي ولا بد للقيد أن ينكسر. If the people want to live, destiny must say yes, and the night must lift up, and the shackles must break. Those powerful words by 1930s Tunisian poet Abul Qasim al-Shabbi were chanted by both Tunisian and Egyptian protesters as they set about dislodging their respective presidents from power. What was striking during those protests in both Tunisia and Egypt, though, was the virtually total absence of anti-American slogans. Some protesters even waved placards which read, "Yes, we can." Does that sound familiar to you? That is an extraordinary development in a region with a high concentration of dictators seen by their own people as practicing tyranny against them in the name of supporting America. Anti-American sentiment in that environment wasn't difficult to find in different parts of the region at different times in recent decades. The fact that anti-American slogans have not bloomed or flourished during the so-called Arab Spring is perhaps an indication that the young in particular see the solution to their country's problems elsewhere. What we know for sure is that they increasingly see themselves as part of a global community looking for a new world of modernity and justice. Not only that, young Arabs have been demonstrating mostly peacefully for months. Take Yemen, for example, a country where not only Al-Qaeda is said to be very active, but also a very conservative society that has traditionally been armed to the teeth. Before young Yemenis get into the squares of protest in the capital Sana'a and elsewhere, sometimes led by women protesters, they put their weapons aside. That's been going on for months now, even while the Yemeni security forces either threaten to open fire on them or actually do open it indeed. These are new and very significant signs of a desire to move from violent means, now thought by many protesters in North Africa and the Middle East, to often make problems much more complicated than they were to start with, to peaceful means that can deliver and have delivered the overthrow of two of the region's most formidable dictators, Ben Ali of Tunisia and Mubarak of Egypt, are two very good cases in point. That seems to bode well for hope and for the future of relations between the Arab-Muslim world and the United States, in my book. But America has to resolve the conundrum that every country faces between the pursuit of its values or of its interests in conducting its foreign policy. There are all sorts of forces that may not necessarily always see a benefit in real change in North Africa and the Middle East. Some of those forces are Arab, some are Israeli, as there are concerns in Israel that a more democratic Egypt could undermine the Camp David Accord. Some of those forces could be Iranian, as the regime in Tehran may feel threatened by the collapse of its ally in Damascus, for example. One or more of those forces and considerations could compound pressure on the United States to go in a particular direction in dealing with the so-called Arab Spring. What I am hearing from the administration, though, and even from many of its critics in Congress, for example, is that they all accept the premise that change has come to North Africa and the Middle East. In 1949, while the world was still busy picking itself up from the ravages of the Second World War, Arthur Miller published his famous play, which you all know, Death of a Salesman. Willie Loman, the play's main protagonist, ends up killing himself in a deliberate car crash so that his son, Biff, can get enough insurance money to become a successful businessman. Using his literary genius, Miller took the long historical view of the American dream. By making material possessions such as the car, the house, and so on a focal point of its pursuit, post-war America abandoned its founding fathers' vision of that dream. That is at least how the Arthur Miller voice I hear in the play as I follow the ups and downs of the so-called Arab Spring sounds. Based on that understanding, my understanding of the play. I'm fascinated by the fact that despite this country's short history, at least for those who think it is short, and despite the fact that it is among the most forward-looking countries in the world I know, Miller chose the past as his reference point in Death of a Salesman. The father dies so that the son can live, but the son will only live a meaningful existence if he doesn't reject the founding fathers' vision of the American dream. If that is a fair interpretation of Arthur Miller, his vision should provide interesting insight to Americans into why the Arabs, with hundreds, thousands of years of history behind them, find the past so compelling. Fast forward to from 1949 to 2010, when another salesman died, also willfully. The death this time, however, is not allegorical, and it's not in America. It is in Tunisia, and literally real. Humiliated and deprived of his livelihood after the authorities had confiscated his fruit cart, young Tunisian Mohammed Bouazizi set himself ablaze, thus igniting protests in Tunisia and throughout the whole North Africa and Middle East region. Nobody knows yet whether Bouazizi's self-immolation is a repudiation of the past or enough of it to bring about meaningful change and modernity to the region. But I feel it is ironic that perhaps an Arab equivalent of the American dream which Miller criticized could have saved Ben Ali and the order he represented in Tunisia, even if it had been accompanied by a minimum modicum of political accountability and hope. It wasn't. During the 23 years of President Ben Ali's iron-fisted grip on Tunisia, the North African nation was widely touted as an economic success story. His government liked to say that the standard of living there approximated Belgium's. So, in a nutshell, he offered the Tunisians a trade-off. They were not allowed to refuse it. Give me your poor and your hungry and your wretched, but also your political freedoms. Well, he got their freedoms, but not always their poor, not always their wretched, not always their hungry. They got him in the end instead. That is very similar to the trade-off in China, with one fundamental difference. In Tunisia, the story about the standard of living being close to Belgium's turned out to be a fable. If in China they have the Communist Party, but also cash and increasing hope, the Tunisians under Ben Ali had crippling unemployment, crushing poverty in parts of the country, and an entire political edifice built on corruption and nepotism. Ben Ali, the Tunisians decided, had finally to be Twittered and Facebooked, and he was. History must have a wicked sense of irony. In 2003, the Bush administration, with 9/11 in the background, used powerful military tools to get rid of a dictator in Iraq called Saddam Hussein. But that happened at a very high cost in lives, material treasure, and political capital for both America and Iraq, although we don't know yet the final outcome in Iraq. In 2010, 2011, millions of young Arabs in places such as Tunisia and Egypt used American-invented tools to organize themselves after the results of a decades-old struggle against those regimes became ripe for the picking. There are two notable ironies here, one actual and one potential. The potential irony would be if the United States somehow failed to get plugged into the Arab people's real desire for peaceful and real change. But the more wicked irony of the two must be the real one. Both Mubarak and Ben Ali had worked hard to connect Egyptians and Tunisians to the internet, but it was the internet that finally got both of them. The moral of the story is that mankind's potential for controlling his own destiny cannot always be foreseen or countered. Both dictators have tried to closely watch how the young of their respective countries interacted with each other and with the outside world, but both clearly failed. During the events in Cairo's Tahrir Square, if you had typed the word Egypt into the computer in China, Chinese Big Brother told you you're going to get nothing, because the Chinese government didn't want the Chinese people to know about what was going on in Egypt. So allow me to say a few things about China, since that's where I started. Enough coffee? The Chinese are an ancient nation, like the Egyptians, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and many others in the Muslim world. They will increasingly be part of a basket of major partners in that part of the globe. They already have substantial oil interests in Sudan and Iran, to mention but two places. They are also busy politically adjusting their foreign policy to their interests in the region. In the past, they were clearly and unabashedly pro-Palestinian, for example. Today, they are much more nuanced towards the Israelis and the Palestinians. That shows their ability to devise adjustable policies. One of the areas where the United States can continue to have the edge, if it wanted to, is in the area of democracy. People in the region can disagree about America's democratic intentions and credentials in North Africa and the Middle East. Americans can disagree about whether supporting democracy in Libya, for example, is an American interest, national, strategic, or otherwise. Fact is, Americans have nurtured a democratic capital over the centuries, while the Chinese simply have not. In addition to economic capital, the Arabs today need democratic capital. The United States can provide it or not. China simply cannot provide it, even if it wanted to. You cannot give what you do not have. I was in a former communist country, Hungary, just a few weeks ago, looking for similarities and differences between what happened in Eastern and Central Europe with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 and what is currently happening in the Middle East and North Africa. Serendipity, again, served me well as I came across reflections on the subject by American billionaire George Soros, a native of Hungary. Agree with him, disagree with him, this is what he says. Reflecting on the Arab Revolution, Soros says, one very important factor is that people were willing to sacrifice their lives for a common cause. That is a memory, a historic event that will change those countries forever. It is irreversible. Revolutions are rarely successful, he says. They often end in tragedy, but they change the behavior of the country afterward. The 1956 Hungarian Revolution was repressed, but it carried within it the seeds of the successful revolution of 1989. Can the Arab world survive, slumbering back into voicelessness and big brotherhood for another 40 years? I never say never, but it may be forced to. But I also have a strong sense that trying to turn back time is like patching up a crumbling house. At some point, the owner of the house will just have to accept the forces of nature and rebuild the house or risk being buried under its rubble. Whether you are Arab or American, watch the outcome of Syria's protests and of the new tug of war between the youth of Egypt and its Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in the run-up to the parliamentary and presidential elections in a few weeks. A good outcome in both places could change the Arab world and its relations with the rest of the world, including and especially this amazingly fascinating country, the United States of America. May Americans and Muslims always remember that a Muslim country, the country of my birth, Morocco, that was first to recognize America's freedom from the shackles of tyranny. May Americans and Muslims always remember that they are much better off in friendship than in enmity, and that they have much to be friends about. May they remember that politics and politicians come and go, but that the spirit of friendship among people is much more durable. May Arabs and Americans always teach their children how to read and write, not just the alphabet, but also the march of history. May Arabs Arab and American mothers always teach their children to dream of wonderful things and wonderful places. May Arab and American children always learn from their siblings how to conquer solitude as they take roads less traveled by towards each other in mutual peace, respect, and dignity. I am humbled by the invite to speak at the General Knox Museum. Thank you all very much for having me.